Hello everyone, welcome to Thursday, it should be March 22nd, and today we are moving on to the beginning of chapter 27 and the Cold War. We will come back and work more on civil rights when we get into the 1960s. Those programs we talked about yesterday, the day before, are more 1950s based, and now we are looking at the foreign affairs side of the 1950s and the late 1940s. You can't think about the post-World War II period without knowing about the Cold War. It is the seminal event of that period for foreign policy. It is the defining moment for America, and it is the focal point of almost everything America does internationally for the next 50 years. So the question I'm asking you to think about today is, was America responsible for the Cold War? I'm not trying to say that because I think America's a bad guy. I think America's a great place. But I want you to give some thought to how this process develops. Think about the fact Stalin is in charge of the Soviet Union. By the time we get to World War II, you have Churchill in Great Britain and Roosevelt in America. These three are the big allies. These are the three big folks that spend the war fighting it, spend their time fighting the war, laying out strategy. And then at the end of the war, Churchill is voted out of office and Roosevelt dies and Truman becomes president. So over the course of the war years, things will happen and then you will start to see changes in that process. All right? So hopefully you read the material I asked you to look at over for homework, okay? You need to understand how we get to the Cold War and how we end up with the policy that we do to keep America involved in the Cold War. Okay, McFarland's article should have been very informational, unfinished business. Just remember, it's not until the mid-1930s that Roosevelt recognizes the Soviet Union. Most Americans did not have any liking of Stalin or the Soviet Union. All right? Remember, we sent troops to fight against the Reds in their own civil war, so they don't like us and they don't trust us either when you think about that, okay? So you've got that taking place. You should have looked at the conferences. How are Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin interacting at the conferences? All right? Preferably, we're going to see how that worked out so that you have an understanding of that. All right? We are going to be looking at a series of video clips, some as long as 10 minutes, others as short as 2 or 3 minutes. This is from a very good series called CNN, The Cold War. Okay? And I've done what I always do. I've taken the videos apart. So you will be able to hear and see what's going on. And also, we will stop and start. The first video that I'm going to show you, or the first segment of the first video that I'm showing you, this one runs about 10 minutes. All right? And when we're done with this video, I'm going to ask you to get into your groups to discuss what you've seen. This one takes us all the way back to the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, because that's where the authors of this series argue the Cold War begins. I'm not suggesting they're right. I'm not suggesting they're wrong. What I'm asking you to do is look at the information as presented in the videos. Think about the information you've already previously read or should have read, and then have the discussions amongst yourself to determine whether you think America was responsible for the Cold War or not. All right, so let's get started with the first video.
On June the 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. It was a day that changed history. Hitler meant to win a vast colony for Germany. Instead, his act would bring Russian power into the heart of Europe only 4 years later. The future outlines of the Cold War began to form as the Nazi tanks surged forward. The Red Army fell back in retreat.
My mother said, go with the soldiers. The soldiers were retreating, injured, covered in blood. I only had my overcoat and my shoes, that's all.
Soviet citizens rallied. Abroad, the Soviet Union won unexpected friends.
Churchill, in spite of his past anti-Soviet feelings, at once welcomed Stalin's Russia as an ally. He did say to his friends, of course, that he'd have welcomed the devil if the devil had turned up in order to help him defeat Hitler.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
America declared war on Japan. Days later, with the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow, Hitler rashly declared war on the United States, making Russians and Americans allies. The German thrust at Moscow was blocked. Stalin broadcast to the nation.
И эти люди, лишенные совести и чести, люди с моралью животных, имеют наглость призывать к уничтожению великой русской нации. Немецкие захватчики хотят иметь истребительную войну с народом СССР. Что же, если немцы хотят иметь истребительную войну, они ее получат.
Stalin already looked beyond victory. He told the British that post-war Soviet boundaries must include the Baltic states and part of Poland.
When I went to Moscow with Anthony Eden in December 1941, when the Germans were still only 19 kilometers away from us as we talked, the very first thing Stalin said at that meeting was, Mr. Eden, I want to have your assurance that at the end of the war you will support my just claim to all these areas, you see. And Eden, tempted to take the back, said, but oughtn't we to be thinking about how we win the war? No, said Stalin, I would like to have this clear at the very beginning. So Eden obviously had to say, well, he had no authority to discuss how the war was to end.
American aid to Russia concentrated on guns and trucks. But Stalin and his people cried out for more, a second front, an Allied landing in Western Europe to relieve Soviet suffering.
I saw the atrocities. I heard the noises of war. Although it's 50 years ago, I can still hear the noises of war. The shells, the bombing, people screaming, women crying.
For 6 months, battle raged at Stalingrad. Hitler sent 500,000 men. The Germans were trapped and forced to surrender. The tide of war was turning. Western opinion cheered on the Red Army, their comrades in arms.
The Russians have thus far lost in the common cause at least 50% more men killed, wounded, and missing than all the rest of the European allies put together. And moreover, they have killed, wounded, and captured at least 20 times as many Germans as the rest of the allies.
The Nazis sought ways to split the alliance against them. At Katyn in western Russia, they dug up the corpses of more than 4,000 Polish officers. Germany announced, truthfully as it turned out, that the officers had been murdered by Soviet security troops in 1940. Britain and America chose to ignore this evidence of Stalin's methods. In 1943, with their alliance still intact, the Big Three prepared to meet at Tehran in Persia.
I was summoned to Tehran to help them prepare for the conference. Mr. Roosevelt is supposed to arrive. We had the code names for it. And so I called the airfield, and sure enough, I spoke to Admiral Leahy. I said, "Are you coming?" And he said, "No, we're not coming. We're going to American mission." And when I said that to Molotov, I thought he'd just fry me alive. I said, "What?" And he'd get all the four-letter words I never heard in my life were spilled over me. He said, "Who the hell are you here anyway? How'd you get in here? What do you know? What am I going to say to Stalin?"
Stalin persuaded Roosevelt that his safety was best assured by residence at the Soviet embassy. The embassy had been specially prepared for his visit. It was bugged.
Иосиф Виссарионович мне сказал, что задачи, которые он ставит...
Stalin told me that the task he was putting to our group, and particularly to me, was ethically very unattractive. However, the position of the USSR was so serious that he had to know what our allies were thinking.
Stalin was very skillful in dealing with Roosevelt and Churchill. Even Churchill began to quite like him, and talk about Uncle Joe. It was quite an affectionate term. And they both had this idea that if you treated him the right way, the phrase was, if you treat Uncle Joe like a member of our club, perhaps one day he will behave like a member of our club.
Ежедневно утром.
Every day, at 8 in the morning, I had to go to Stalin. I went with all the transcripts, in Russian and in English. For about an hour, Stalin examined, in great detail, all of Roosevelt's conversations.
Выяснял все детали разговоров, которые вел Рузвельт.
I don't think FDR was capable of conceiving of a man of such profound iniquity, coupled with enormous strategic cleverness, as Stalin. He had never met such a creature. And Stalin was an excellent actor, quiet, affable, reasonable. He sent them all away thinking this really is a great leader.
The Allies agreed that post-war Eastern Europe would be a Soviet zone of influence. Stalin would annex Eastern Poland. As compensation, the Poles would get a slice of Eastern Germany. Poland was offered no choice. Together, the Big Three mapped out the future.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do is get into your groups and take just a few minutes, or you should be in your groups, just a few minutes to talk about this. Think about what was just said, okay? In the very beginning of the war, when the Soviets are first brought into the war and the Germans are almost at the doorstep of Moscow, just like Napoleon was, right at the gates of Moscow, Stalin's meeting with Churchill, or with Churchill's emissaries, and he's saying that he needs to have the Baltic states and Eastern Poland. Why? Why do you think Stalin wants that territory? Think about that, okay? Think about the support the U.S. is giving him in 1942. Why do the Allies choose to ignore the Katyn massacre when the Germans dig it up? Okay? Think about what's going on. These are the very, very beginning, early moments of what is ultimately going to become the Cold War. All right? So spend just a few minutes. I don't expect you to spend 20 or 30. We've got a lot more to get done today. So please spend a few minutes discussing this, talk about it, and then we will move on. You will need to go to the part 2 tape after to continue.